Hello everyone, I'm Max,
I'm Paige Souls.
And I'm Cameron from Living.
and this is our presentation on what we think are the flaws of the prison system in the United States.
In the United States, we face many different ethical lenses on how people get released in overcrowded prisons. We look at it through what people did in order to get released early and how they acted in order to get released. And we looked at it through the way the judges look at people whenever they're deciding who should get out in overcrowding. Whenever we looked at it, it's usually very biased. Usually when it comes to overcrowding, drug charges are the first to get released, and they look at it through what kind of drug you were looking at. And whenever I looked through it, we saw studies that show African Americans that do crack cocaine also get longer sentences and don't get released whenever it comes to white people that do crack cocaine. They look at it through their income and what kind of money they make and what type of outlook they're going to have on life after they get released. We also looked at it through, is our justice system viable? As some of you guys are aware, there was a Turner versus the People case where a Stanford student sexually assaulted another student. And in this case, he was a professional swimmer and he was very wealthy. His sentence got reduced from, it was supposed to be 6 months and it got reduced down to 3 months. And it was also because he was paid, and the judge who gave him his sentence decided that a harsh sentence would impact his career. We looked at it through the AB 2888 bill that requires a state prison to sentence anyone convicted of sexual assault. This bill was broken in his case because he was only given such a short sentence for his actions. We looked at it through the way judges see minorities and people without lots of money and how they are sentenced longer, and the overall effect was that money can be used to impact the way people get sentenced and whether or not they're released from prison.
So I did the economic lens for what are the flaws of our prison system. And when you look at the economic implications of how our prison system works, it's actually kind of shocking at first when you realize what's going on. So the way it works is the government has privatized our prison system, and this began when Reagan was president back in the 80s. And his system, he thought that the competitive market would drive down prices, which were at the time rising. He thought it would lower prison population, and believed it would be super beneficial for the government. And then, obviously it started opened, and it became pretty profitable for the people who went into that market, supplying services for the prisons, architecture. The people who were in these markets, made a lot of money, and it was very profitable for them. And since then, it's just encouraged the population to grow, and the prison population has been growing, and it's quite big now. And there hasn't really been a lot of change in the actual policy of how we contract our private prisons, and therefore progress has been pretty slow. So the first perspective we're going to look at here is the perspective that the system in which that Reagan had envisioned for the prison contracting wasn't necessarily wrong, but just the way that the government goes at it is. So a lot of this information was taken from a scholastic journal, as the Columbia Journal of Law and Social Problems, and that it stated that the government, as the consumer of, they're the one who pays the private prisons, they have the power over them, sort of affect how their deals go down, how they get the contracts, who gets the contracts as far as which companies. And they should be able to enforce their deal. They should be able to do things that are beneficial for them. However, the methods that they use are flawed. They don't promote a competitive market in the right way that it should be. And it says here that when the market first opened, the first firms that got into there got a really big majority of the actual market. And since then, it's the same companies. It's the same 3 firms that own pretty much all of the private prisons in America, the federal prisons, the state prisons, ones that are opened probably here are probably owned by the same groups. and it's these three specific groups. It's the CCA, the Corrections Corps of America. They hold 53.8% of America's prison population is actually resides in their prison. And then there's a GEO group that owns 27.4% of the population. And then there's one more called the Management and Training Corporation, and they are also the third dependent firm that owns most of the prison population in America. The government has become increasingly dependent on these three firms. So as time has gone on, we've sort of dug ourselves into a deeper hole with being reliant on these three specific firms to house our prison population and keep them alive and healthy. So at the end of this journal that I was reading, it suggested that the market can still be utilized, that the system that Reagan envisioned was not wrong, that if we really promoted a competitive market where we can drive out these monopolies and we can get in new firms and new people with better ideas, that it would create better circumstances for the prices we face and the population increasing, that if the competitive market was utilized in the correct way, that it would actually work. So for our second perspective, this is more arguing that the whole system is wrong, that the policies that Reagan began were obviously aimed at combating the prices and the populations, and since then, population has grown 790%, and how much we actually spend on housing these prisoners has tripled. So it's obviously not working what he did. It's not doing very good, and it's possible to decrease the population actually by utilizing newer systems that utilize like labor-based rehabilitation. By giving these prisoners work and things to do, they can help readjust to enter society and actually become productive members of it. And there are other prison systems that promote more humane treatment, that have a more community-based lifestyle, that have shown really low rates of recidivism, which is a big problem in the US, where people commit a crime, they get let out, and then they come back. There's no treatment in the US prison system where people get actually treated for a lot of the things that cause them to really act out in these ways. But there are alternatives that exist in the world that we're just not looking at as a country, we're not investing in, and we're not really paying attention to the solutions that could really work for us.
Okay, so I did sociocultural. America is an outlier among the countries that use prisons efficiently. A majority of America's prisoners are ethnic minorities, including African Americans and Latinos. Racism is one of the biggest flaws in the criminal or prison system, targeting people based on their background. These growing statistics are affecting all generations of people and their daily lives. This ties back to our original question because this is a huge flaw that is being broadcasted across America with the recent hate crimes of police brutality against African American people. It is a controversial topic that ties into the motive of if the prison system is viable or just a profit business for many people who are associated with it. Our country's prison system has deep racism built into almost every step. These acts include drug offense, longer sentencing, lessening abilities to get jobs after being released, and taking away rights like voting. The University of Kansas professors found that police conducted investigative stops of African American males twice the rate of Caucasians. Currently, there are 2.3 million prisoners in America, and around 600,000 are awaiting trial. Prisoners cost American taxpayers around $80 billion at roughly $34,000 per inmate. In 1970, America held 200,000 inmates, and the growth started back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan's administration introduced tougher penalties dealing with drugs and enforcing a strong racial biases on sentencing. Police brutality against African Americans has been broadcasted in the news in the past year. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Alton Sterling are among the 258 people killed from police brutality in 2016. Police are more likely to use force like tasers, dogs, pepper spray against African Americans during arrest. According to the Sentencing Project, founded in 1986, that works for a fair and effective criminal justice system, African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate of 5.1 times more than any other race. If the statistics continue, 1 in every 4 African American males can expect to go to prison at least once in his lifetime. When Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, there were about 100,000 African Americans in prison. Now there are about 800,000 in jails. After being incarcerated, minorities face challenges. More than half of all federal prisoners are there for drug offenses. The U.S. Sentencing Commission reported that 25% of all drug convictions in 2014 were African Americans. African American men were sentenced 19% longer time periods in federal courts than across the U.S. and white men convicted of a similar crime in a 4-year study. Building a new life is made even more difficult by police policies which continue to punish criminals long after they have served their time. In many states, former felons are banned from claiming food stamps and getting public housing. In some trades, having a conviction can keep you out of work entirely. The racial profiling is unfair and racial profiling and unfair acts in the prison system are diminishing African Americans' quality of life while not making the world any safer. There are solutions to all the flaws discussed. Bigger prison systems cut back the quality, and prisoners were confined to windowless cells without access to education or sensory stimulation. To prevent overcrowding, justice systems should rehabilitate prisoners more, which can reduce recidivism by 10 to 30%. Also, low-risk prisoners could be tagged with GPS ankle monitors that track where they are. Ex-convicts who find a job and place to live are less likely to return to crime. In Norway, prisoners can start new jobs within 18 months before they are released. The money saved with all these solutions can be spent on other resources to reduce crime, such as hiring more police and improving schools in rough neighborhoods. Prison systems that promote more humane treatment along with small community-based lifestyles have low rates of recidivism and could be a viable alternative. In conclusion, for our prison system to work smoothly, we need to be unbiased, equal, and organized.
That's right. I'm walking off over here. Look at me. I'm right.
So describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of your group discussion.
Well, we had to change our question a couple times. Our original question was a more broader question. Like the umbrella of topics that it occupied was a little more, too big for us. We wanted to be more precise in what our focus was. So when we changed it, we changed our question to a more, specific question, and that it made our content, and therefore I think it made it smoother because it was more focused on the specific area that we were talking about. So that would definitely change our content a lot. It made it more honed in.
What is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from the team presentation, and why?
We discussed many different, we discussed many different perspectives in this, and we all had very different ideas of what we were going to talk about and the way we were going to express them, and it just kind of came down to when we were working on our presentation what seemed more important and what seemed like it was going to fit and make more be more understood when we were discussing our presentation.
Thank you.